I'm Dr. Tasia White, and you're listening to Things My Boss Never Told Me. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my show, Things My Boss Never Told Me. I am Dr. Tasia White, and I'm just so excited to start this project. So just to give you a little bit of background, this was an idea that I had many years ago, but not to necessarily do it as a podcast per se, but the idea of writing this book called Things My Boss Never Told Me has been kind of lingering in my mind for about 5 years now. And it was during a time where I made a transition from being a mid-level manager to a senior level manager and realizing some of the nuances of supervising an entire department versus, a small group, a small staff. And I say small, I had at one point in my career a staff of 25. So, that's small. But, kind of making that transition from, being a part of one department to being the head of a department. And just kind of realizing that there was so much that I didn't know about leadership and supervision that I wished that I'd learned before going into that role. But nonetheless, it was a good adventure, a good opportunity for me overall. And so the concept of this podcast is to share, my stories, my insight, my experiences in hopes that those who are either transitioning into leadership roles or who are looking to transition into leadership roles, so aspiring leaders, can find something insightful, useful to maybe adopt into their own leadership approach. At the end of the day, I want this podcast to be insightful, which I've used that word a lot, so my apologies. I want it to be something useful, something that is like a practical tool that leaders or aspiring leaders can draw upon as they navigate their different experiences. So with that said, let me tell you a little bit about myself. So again, I'm Dr. Tasia White, and I am a doctor of education. I completed my doctorate in 2020, and it was an interesting time to say the least, but during that time, it was also a lot of great transitions and transformations that have led me to this point today. And what I mean by that is up until May of 2020, I was a college administrator. I'd worked in higher education for over 10 years at that point and moved up fairly quickly in that short time. Like, I started as a entry-level residence hall director, 6 months after graduating from college. And then by the time I left higher education, I was an assistant dean of students. So I consider that to be a very fast transition, especially when I, look at the trajectory of my peers at other institutions. Just a lot happened for me. A lot of opportunities happened for me to put me in that position. And for that, I am truly grateful. And it's those experiences that I will draw a lot of my insights and stories from, but also my educational background, which is in organizational leadership, performance improvement, human resource development, adult education. So really also tying in some of the scholarly insights as well as, the insights from other great leaders who maybe are outside of the academic realm. I'm someone who likes to keep an open mind to all possibilities, all perspectives. And so I don't necessarily see myself as, speaking solely from an academic, scholarly standpoint, really just drawing from different pieces and making sense of it for that particular situation. That's just kind of the approach that I've taken in life in general. And so that is also the approach that I will take in this podcast in terms of sharing, different insights. So not only will I provide my own experiences and background, but I will also be drawing from the knowledge that I've collected from other folks who have been in similar roles, who have written some great books, who I consider to be great leaders. I think it's going to be a really insightful experience nonetheless, which I use that word again, darn. I need to find another word for insightful. Anyway, as I mentioned, up until May of 2020, I was a college administrator, and it was a wonderful, fulfilling experience for me up until that point. And, much of what drew me to work in the field of higher education was, one, I'd always considered myself an educator. So education was just something that was always part of my makeup. I went to a high school that specialized in teaching. So really education has been, at my core from as early as I can remember. There was a point in elementary school, actually. So full disclosure, I'm from New York City originally, Harlem, New York. And I had some really interesting experiences kind of being in the New York City public school system, which I'm not knocking it by any means. But, there are certain things that kind of slip through the cracks. And so one of those things was my lovely 6th grade teacher, who actually, if it wasn't for her, probably would not have considered education as a potential career opportunity. But nonetheless, I remember being in this class, and, that entire year was probably my most miserable year in elementary school. That's when I was being, bullied even more so by people who were my friends previously. And so it was kind of like, wait, what happened? How do we go from, being BFFs to now you're picking on me? How does that work? And then I had this teacher who would just kind of feed into it. And so she would kind of create this drama. One day she did this thing where she, again, just terrible, where she tricked the entire class into thinking that we had some kind of food poisoning. One of the kids, one of my classmates, brought in some chocolate chips, and we were all kind of sneaking around. She wasn't even in the school. She was running late that day, so we had a substitute teacher in there. And so we're kind of sneaking around eating this chocolate. And then I kind of left the class to go do a development thing. I can't remember the name of it. And so I returned to class, and so she's there, and I'm like, oh, great. And so she's like, hey, did you eat that chocolate so-and-so was sharing? And I was like, yeah. She's like, oh, well, you're probably going to be sick soon because that chocolate was expired. And so she is telling us this story about how the chocolate was expired and we're probably going to start throwing up. And so, the placebo effect comes in. And so many of us are starting to feel a little queasy, our stomach is, rumbling. We're feeling a little nauseous, all of this stuff. And then about an hour or two into it, she finally, burst out laughing, saying that she made it all up and that we were all going to be fine. That is a terrible thing to do to 11-year-olds. Oh my gosh. So that just kind of gives you an idea of the type of person that she was. But I remember one day she did this thing. Actually, I can't remember what exactly she did, but it was something that just put me over the edge. And I finally said to her, I'm going to be a teacher. And she was like, what? And I was like, I'm going to be a teacher so that I can be better than you. And she just kind of looked at me, and I said it with the most straight face possible. I was just like, I'm going to be better than you. You're a bad teacher. I'm going to be a better teacher than you. And she kind of looked at me and then kind of laughed it off or whatever. And so thanks to her, education has always kind of been my trajectory. So here we are today. And I do a lot of reflecting, especially now, just kind of trying to get a sense for, where certain feelings and thoughts come from, and I'm able to connect it back to a memory. So for me, becoming an educator is something that I connect back to that teacher. Since then, I've seen the value of having great educators, helping students learn and grow, both in an academic, traditional academic setting, but also personally. And so while in 6th grade I had that terrible experience, the very next year in 7th and 8th grade, I had the most wonderful teacher, Miss Williams, and she was just a breath of fresh air and really encouraging us to, think outside of the box and providing us opportunities to learn and grow and develop ourselves and learning from each other. Like at one point she did this thing where she invited each student to create a lesson plan or some kind of program, and then she would dedicate some time for that student to conduct that particular lesson plan. And so I remember one of my classmates, he was really into basketball, and so we did a whole segment on basketball 101. And granted, going into it, many of us were like, oh, like I don't really know, like I was a little girly, so like basketball was kind of like whatever. But by the end of it, like I really appreciated, learning the fundamentals of basketball. And while I'm still not necessarily, interested in sports, I at least have an appreciation for it, so I can, watch a basketball game and understand what's happening and appreciate what's unfolding in front of me. And, also I found out that I was a little good at basketball, mainly because of my height, but also like it was just kind of a fun activity and it inspired competition, which is something that I hadn't really participated in activities that really brought out that competitive side of me. And so another thing that I learned is that I can be very competitive. Like if I'm really, really invested, I can be very competitive. But otherwise I tend to be more laid back and like, hey, you do you, I do me. But anyway, so just education has always kind of been at the forefront in terms of, the direction that I wanted to go in. And being a college administrator allowed me the opportunity to be an educator in a non-traditional sense. So like I didn't have a particular subject that I needed to master and share that with students. Instead, I was able to help my students develop their soft skills. And, when you look at the position descriptions of, many of the jobs in higher education, you don't necessarily see that as kind of the main focus. But to me, I felt like it was the main focus because I felt that it was important to take advantage of teachable moments. And whether that was in a conduct meeting that I was conducting or in a roommate conflict that I was trying to mediate, there was always these opportunities to provide some important lessons on personal growth and development to my students. So again, being a college administrator is something that I found really fulfilling, especially when I think about, creating like trainings and professional development opportunities for my staff and my colleagues. Like that's something that really motivated me. And I think that's partially why my degrees are in the areas of human performance improvement and adult education and human resource development, because that's really what I value at my core. So nonetheless, being a college administrator really provided me the opportunities to kind of feed my soul because it was something that I was so passionate about. Now, one of the things about working in higher education, especially in a small school, there's a lot of transition. And so one of those transitions was me kind of stepping away from doing the personal professional development stuff that I enjoyed and having to learn a whole new skill set in an area that I had zero knowledge in. And it was in like the health and mental health arena. And I take that back. I wouldn't say that I was completely clueless of that subject, but I didn't feel like I was well versed enough to be leading that particular area. And so in my last role, in my last year, it was a huge transition for me to kind of have to learn these skill sets that I was not familiar with, while also trying to lead people who were the experts and trying to tell them like, you should do this, and me kind of learning from them like, oh no, you can't do it that way because of X, Y, and Z. So I feel like that's a really tough position for any leader to be in, but I'm grateful for the experience because it taught me how to kind of open myself up to a different kind of challenge. And while I didn't necessarily enjoy that job, to be completely frank, I definitely feel like I learned a lot about myself through that process. And much of what I learned about myself is kind of ingrained in how I'm moving forward in life. So for example, mindfulness is one's personal setting as well as a professional setting. And that's one of the things that I learned in that year of, understanding how to be more mindful and how I can use that to connect with others, connect more deeply with myself. And granted, I was kind of doing this on a small scale, but learning more about mindfulness really allowed me to expand upon it in a way that was more effective in my life. And so with that said, I think that taking on that role really pushed me actually to look beyond higher education and find opportunities for sharing my passion with everyone. I would say coupled with that was the research that I was doing for my dissertation. So one of the things that I focused on was the retention and advancement of administrators of color in higher education. Because one of the things that I was noticing was that, there weren't too many of us at upper level, like the senior and executive level in higher education. And granted, it was kind of kismet that there were a lot of things that happened during the pandemic that kind of brought that subject to the forefront. And so I was able to kind of tap into that when conducting my interviews for my dissertation. But nonetheless, I was just noticing that, there weren't too many people who looked like me at those senior and executive levels. And as I moved up in my higher education career, I realized there were fewer and fewer people moving up with me. And so I really wanted to understand why, what was the cause, and got some really great insight from that. And one of the things that really stood out to me was the fact that a lot of people who were coming after me didn't have the resources, the tools, the mentorship that I received. I feel like I've been very blessed in terms of getting the right information from the right people. I have some amazing mentors going all the way back to college to now that I still, reach out to. And so if it wasn't for them, I probably wouldn't have moved up as quickly as I did. And so realizing that, not everyone has that resource, I realized that there was an opportunity for me to pivot and look at ways to provide that growth and development for other administrators of color, or just administrators in general, because I think part of the challenge, particularly in higher education, is the fact that there really isn't any set description or pathway for moving forward. You just kind of go in and see, where you kind of land. Unlike some industries where, there's a clear step 1, step 2, step 3, you do this. In higher education, that's not always the case. You can start as an entry level and then be senior level administrator, in your very next role. So for me, I just saw an opportunity to provide some direction to help others expand their leadership skills and find opportunities for expanding upon their leadership capacity in a way that helped push them forward to the next position that they wanted to have, whether it be inside or outside of higher education. And so with that, I started my own company, Vonni Coaching and Consulting, LLC, and it's been an interesting process, becoming an entrepreneur and learning all of the nuances of being self-employed. When you work in a large setting like, a college or university, you're kind of used to having certain things laid out. You have certain departments that kind of execute things, and, you can pass things off. Whereas when you're self-employed, you pass it off to yourself, or you put on the back burner. And so, learning how to prioritize certain tasks and figuring out when and how to reach out to help and where to get that help has been all a huge learning process for me. And so when I decided to step away from my position in May, I really dove into kind of starting that process of becoming an entrepreneur, establishing my business, and also trying to complete my degree, because at that point I was not done. And it was also at that point, and a huge reason why I decided to step away from my job was, there was a lot of expectations that were being put on me, and I was really feeling like I needed to either prioritize my work and trying to understand all of these new pieces, especially in a pandemic where if we're going to bring students back to campus, what does that look like? And me not having a medical degree, I felt a little vulnerable in that position. But I also felt like while I'm very open to learning and expanding and stretching myself. However, trying to do that while trying to also write a dissertation just did not compute. I was just so close to finishing that the idea of having to prolong that another 6 months so that I could learn these other facets of my job just seemed overwhelming. And so I prioritized finishing my degree because at that point I was spending more money than I was making, sadly, because I had to pay for the degree myself. And I was also passionate about my topic and wanting to make sure that I shared that topic with others, especially at that time, given, again, what was happening, particularly around like the George Floyd situation and students kind of stepping up and calling out their colleges and universities for not being supportive of, what was happening nationally, but also how the pandemic added an extra layer of complexity, particularly for at-risk students, and I say that with air quotes, but essentially students who maybe, came from really tough backgrounds. And, the idea of being home was more of a challenge for their academic success. And colleges and universities is kind of being like, well, you figure it out. I will acknowledge that. Some who were much more supportive. But, there was a majority of them that were just kind of like, well, we're closed. You kind of have to do whatever. And so that just kind of brought some different topics to my dissertation and how administrators of color were feeling overwhelmed and pressured to be more involved in providing support for particularly students of color who were in that at-risk category, air quote, and with them having their own challenges with trying to deal with the pandemic and the George Floyd situation, and just there being a lot of pressure, which I also felt. And so nonetheless, there were some really great conversations that came out of that. And if you're interested in checking out my dissertation, you can go to my website where I have like Padlet that kind of outlines the main points of my research. So anyway, I definitely felt a calling to step out of my traditional role as a college administrator and more into a resource, a provider, a helper of people who have been in similar positions as me. And so I feel like this podcast really contributes to that mission of wanting to help others navigate their professional world with more ease and balance. So something else to learn about me is that I would say, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, I've taken a more spiritual approach to life in general. And by that, I mean just kind of being more mindful and intentional about how I move about in the world, how I interact with others, how I learn from my mistakes and, look for opportunities that are more aligned with my personal values. And that's something that I think more people should take into account. I think there are a lot of people who are in jobs that make them unhappy because, those jobs still really align with who they are at their core. And I saw that firsthand when I was taken out of my role where I was able to provide different leadership and learning opportunities for my staff and my students and my colleagues. It was in that moment when I was taken out of that and into a new role that I realized that that's really what I was passionate about and felt like I needed to find a way to get back to it. So my company, Vonni Coaching and Consulting, is really my contribution to, one, my soul and, what I feel deeply passionate about, but also my contribution to the world. Feeling like that there is a need to provide more insight and structure and advice on how to navigate the professional realm, particularly as it relates to leadership advancement. When I think about why coaching and consulting, I'm kind of reminded of just situations where I had like friends and family members just kind of reach out to me for advice on how to handle certain situations. like thinking about when certain colleagues were frustrated about the performance of an individual and me providing them with the advice on how to help them approach the situation, how they could maybe navigate it in a way that was more intentional and practical versus kind of just expressing their frustration. And then from the consulting standpoint, just feeling like I was put in a lot of situations where I was able to look at areas for improvement and provide solutions to those areas. I consider myself to be a creative problem solver, and there have been many instances where just an idea came to me and I don't necessarily know where the idea came from, but just having a few important details, I was able to resolve the issue and be able to help move people forward. That was very helpful as a college administrator because I was able to help my students problem solve, but also I was able to find solutions to problems that, that benefited my department and my colleagues as a whole. And so I feel like Vonni coaching and consulting allows me to tap into that a little bit more and be able to, share that with those who seek out my services. Both of my degrees, my master's and my doctorate, focus on evaluation and like front-end analysis as well as just assessment in general. And so I am very observant and I kind of assess things before I'm even asked to assess things and try to provide some solutions for improvement. Since pursuing my degrees, I have been able to assign some language to it, but I think that was just kind of a quality I already possessed. For example, I think about when I started at my second institution in upstate New York, and there were things that I noticed about the department that I felt like could have been strengthened, could have been improved, but didn't necessarily want to share that like right off the bat. Like, the new person coming in didn't want to be like, hey, I think you should do this because this would make things better. I really wanted to take the time to get to know the landscape and then be able to provide some insight and advice. And so I started in August of 2010. And by January of 2011, there was an opportunity for me to work with my boss on a particular project. And I used that as an opportunity to say, hey, I noticed you were having these issues. Here's some ideas that I would like to share with you to hopefully improve that. And all of the ideas that I shared really panned out well to the point where now, over 10 years later, those ideas are still put in place at that institution, which I think is kind of cool that still exists, that is kind of my legacy that I'm leaving behind at that institution. And that was just me kind of observing, where I felt like the opportunities were for improvement. So that's something that I really am attracted to from a consulting standpoint. Whereas from a coaching standpoint, helping the individuals find solutions to their, interpersonal issues, whether it be with colleagues, with performing a particular task, with just trying to improve themselves in general, and be able to provide some advice on how to improve upon those things so that it can push them forward. One example that I can think of is I had a person on my team who, whenever they had an issue, they would come to me. And so they'd be like, hey, Tasia, blah, blah, blah is happening. What do I do? And so we'd sit there and kind of go back and forth. And then a little bit later, okay, Tasia, we have this problem. What should I do? And then we go back and forth. In doing that, while I enjoyed the problem solving, because again, that's something that I enjoy doing and I feel that that's my strength, I also recognized that I wasn't really helping them by constantly giving them the answers. And so what I did was use it as a teachable moment by providing that person with some tools on how to do their own problem solving. And I actually took this from an old class that I used to teach. I went to a specialized high school for teaching, and it was a magnet school. And so everyone that attended that high school went with the intention of becoming a teacher at some point. And with that, as part of our curriculum, we had to do a weekly internship at a school of our choosing, where we would be in a classroom setting and, getting to know what it is like to be a teacher. Now, granted, there were some students who, took advantage of that and did some other things during that time because we got out of school early. And then we had a special pass in the event that we were, stopped by the police. We could show them like, hey, this is what I'm doing and this is where I'm supposed to be going, so that we didn't get arrested for truancy. So nonetheless, we had this internship that we had to do every Wednesday after lunch. I had the opportunity to return to my junior high school and work with one of my absolute favorite educators. She's actually the reason I became a leader. There was a program called Peer Leadership, and she identified me as someone who would be a good candidate for the peer leadership program. And since then, I've just remained in contact with Miss Terry, because just that program really transformed me into standing out and being in more leadership roles. So it was a program where we did some community service. We did some preventative education on drug and alcohol use and the impact on one's body long term, because at that age, junior high school, kids were being exposed to that early on. And so we were really there to be role models for our peers and help them to see a different way, to find an alternative to kind of the negative influences that may be out there within the community. And so the peer leadership program was just a wonderful experience for me, because again, it really pushed me in that leadership role and helped me to understand what it means to be a role model, what it means to help others, to serve others, and overall just a wonderful experience. Like, when I think back to my early adolescent years, I can just see how much that program in particular really shaped who I am today. Because of that, I wanted to go back to my junior high school and be of service to Miss Terry. And she trusted me enough to teach my own class. And so even though I was only maybe a year or two older, I had 3 students in my class, and I taught a life skills class. And this was a class that I had attended when I was at the junior high school, so I was very familiar with the content and the curriculum. And so I was working with these 3 young ladies. I say young ladies, and we were practically the same age. But I was working with these 3 young ladies to work through this curriculum. And one of the lessons that really stuck with me, even now in my adulthood, was a lesson on decision making. And the concept was, we would get a scenario, and then, it would kind of end with, all right, so this person has to make a decision based on the scenario. And we were asked to provide 3 possible ways to handle the situation. And then 3 possible consequences for that, whether they are good or bad. And then provide some kind of outcome based on one of the solutions that we provided. And so, when I was teaching the class, like, we had a workbook and they gave like little scenarios like, oh, Johnny was offered cigarettes by his friend Tom. Should Johnny take the cigarettes from Tom? And then you provide 3 possible solutions. Like, Johnny could say no and run away. Johnny could take the cigarettes from Tom. And Johnny could respectfully decline. And then the consequence could be, if Johnny decided to run away, then Tom may, think that he's a coward and make fun of him at school the next day. Another consequence could be that, if Johnny accepted the cigarettes, he could get really sick and get in trouble with his parent. And then the third one could be Tom may appreciate Johnny's decision and walk away calmly. And the last step of that 3-step process would be to write out how this scenario would end. So nonetheless, it was just a really cool exercise that helped me in terms of understanding decision making, and something that I continue to do in my adulthood. So fast forward to working with the member of my team, when they would come to me on an ongoing basis, I saw this as an opportunity to teach them this particular problem-solving technique. And so when we had our next one-on-one meeting, I explained to them, I appreciate you coming to me, and I think that clearly you respect my perspective, and I want to continue to provide that, but I also want to empower you to have your own perspective and to find your own solutions. So rather than come to me with the problem, I would like you to brainstorm at least 3 different solutions. And if you're worried, come up with 3 different consequences. And then you and I can talk about it. And then we can, make a decision from there. But I want you to do the initial thinking of how the situation could be handled. And I will just kind of act as a guide, so to speak, to help you navigate which one is the best solution. And, they appreciated that. And within a week, we went through a few scenarios. There was an issue that came up and they told me, I could do this, or this. And we kind of talked through what was most effective. And then they were able to proceed. But I'll say after that week, came to me less and less. It was more of a situation of, hey, this happened. This is how I handled it. I just wanted to let you know. And I thought that was really cool because 1, I used a technique that I learned all the way in junior high school. But 2, it did what I intended it to, which was to empower that individual to make their own decisions, to find their own solutions based on their own creativity and their own perspective. And so that's the type of coaching that I feel like doesn't happen all the time. I think very often there's this assumption that, the leader is just kind of there to make all of the decisions. And that's definitely not my style. Like, I recognize that I don't have all of the answers. I may have some good solutions and some good answers, but I certainly do not have all of them. And so I respect the opinions of others and really try to surround myself with those who have a different approach than I do, so that we can collectively work together and really see all perspectives, all sides. Sometimes what I think may not necessarily be correct, and I recognize that. So making sure that I had a team that was well-rounded in terms of my strengths and weaknesses, and from there we, work together. My assumption is that there are not enough leaders who think how to kind of coach their teams and how to support these little nuances that may be relevant to the job, the company, the work that they're doing. So nonetheless, with Vonni Coaching and Consulting, I wanted to be a resource for leaders who are trying to improve their relationships with their teams, or for individuals who are not getting that kind of support from their leaders, but want to eventually be in a better position than they are at the moment. And so that's kind of how Vonni Coaching and Consulting came to life. So with Vonni Coaching and Consulting, I'm taking the information I gathered from my research and recognizing that there was a need, and then taking my own personal interest around problem solving and helping others, kind of married those two in the creation of this company. So there were a lot of people who, when I shared with them my concept, they were like, oh, you're going to do coaching and consulting? Like, that's going to be a lot of work. Most people do one or the other. And you're right, that is absolutely true. However, I'm always happy to take on a challenge. So at the end of the day, I just want to be as helpful as possible. And I think that the creation of this podcast is just another avenue that leads back to that overall goal. And all of the transition that I experienced last year in 2020, during the pandemic, with deciding to resign from my job and focus on finishing my degree, with moving, with kind of starting a new life as an entrepreneur, with expanding upon certain relationships while creating new ones, with incorporating more mindfulness and intentionality into my daily life. I've come to this realization that at the end of the day, I want to live with purpose. I remember many years ago, I say it was probably back in 2015, I had this book, and one of the things that the book asked you to do is kind of like one of those self-help workbooks. And it was kind of like helping you to figure out, what do you want your life to look like 5 years from now? And one of the activities in the book was to write your own personal mission statement, like, not connected to any work or career or anything. This is just your personal belief. And back then I wrote the mission statement. I want to make every interaction meaningful, impactful, and positive. And I think that still is true today. So when I think about living with purpose, I'm reminded of this activity that I actually did recently, and it came from the book, The Buddha and the Badass, written by Vijay Lakhiani. So I would describe this book, and I think he uses this term as well, as being great for spiritual entrepreneurs. Like if you're not really sure where to start and what to do in terms of identifying the more spiritual components for your brand, I highly recommend this book. You may hear me refer to this book again in a later episode. But nonetheless, the activity was to help the readers identify their purpose, why they're doing this particular work. But from the activity, I identified 5 things that I truly value. And these are the things that I feel like really contribute to what I mean by living with purpose. Celebrating originality, practicing mindfulness, seeking edification, exemplifying integrity, and the final one is provide encouragement. And so with that, I have created this vision for just how I see myself as well as my company kind of evolving over time. Like, this is the trajectory. And I want to share this with you because I think it will give you a little bit more insight about who I am at my core. And so when you hear this, I think it will make sense in terms of what I've shared up until this point. But I also want to share this so that you can get a sense for whether or not this is the podcast for you, whether or not I'm the person that you want to seek advice from. At the end of the day, I don't want to sell anything. I feel like I'm a terrible salesperson. I worked at Victoria's Secret when, right after college. That was my first retail job. I absolutely hated it. And my managers knew that I wasn't very good at it. I wasn't really good at selling the products, but they appreciated my interpersonal approach, and they appreciated that, I would go out of my way to help the customers who were seeking my help. Whereas some of the others were kind of here, take this, and kind of run off to the next person. I didn't care about my numbers in terms of how many customers I touched. I cared more about getting them the products that they needed and making sure that it was the right product that they needed. And even though I kind of started the job as a seasonal worker, I was one of 5 from that seasonal period who were asked to stay on to continue working at Victoria's Secret, which I thought was pretty cool. Unfortunately, shortly after that, literally within 2 weeks, I got my first position in higher education, so I didn't get to continue. But, I share all of that to say I am not the type of person to sell any kind of product. I'm not, gimmicky. That's just not what I'm about. What I am about is the people and how we make people feel and how we can help improve each other. Because I think that when you help one person, you help all people. And I think that this vision that I've created really mirrors those sentiments. I want all of you listening to figure out whether or not this resonates with you. And if it doesn't, okay. And if it does, great. We're going to have a great time together, and I'm going to have some more funny moments where I'm really awkward, and I may even have some funny stories to share. But I want to make sure that you understand who I am so that you can decide whether or not I'm the type of person that you want to listen to or the type of person that you want to get advice from. So with that said, here is my vision. Imagine a world where we celebrate everyone's individuality. We use mindful practices to strengthen the relationships with ourselves, our loved ones, and our community at large. We actively seek edification because we want to evolve with the changing world around us. We exemplify integrity to honor one another as human beings. We share encouragement to everyone who wants to listen. We're elevating the masses, one action at a time. And with the right amount of friction, nourishment, and support, we discover the elements that make us all shine. So one of the things I want to mention is the logo for Vonni Coaching Consulting. There's a diamond. And to me, the diamond represents, being able to shine, to share your light, to share your message, to share whatever it is that you are gifted in with those around you. And when you think about the creation of a diamond, there's a lot of friction involved in creating it. And I chose that symbol intentionally because, sometimes we need friction to help us shine. Sometimes we need to have certain experiences that may be unpleasant in the moment, maybe a lot of pressure, maybe a lot of overwhelm. But if we're able to work through it, we're able to shine bright. And so the diamond to me represents that evolution, that transition of, having to go through some challenging things in order to shine bright. And, there are some people who may not necessarily feel the same way. Like, they certainly don't welcome friction, and I don't either. But I do try to see the friction that is created as an opportunity to grow and learn. And many of the stories that I will share with you, will be just that friction that I had to go through in order to become the person that I am today. Okay, so here are the topics that you can anticipate going forward in this first season. And these are no in particular order. In fact, I haven't really decided which order I want to go in just yet. But these are just some of the topics that are near and dear to me that I feel like I want to touch on as kind of a foundation. So here we go. Leadership versus management. Transactional leadership versus transformative leadership. Calling in versus calling out. Developing interpersonal credibility. Boundaries, expectations, and accountability. Mindful practices and leadership. How to make your people shine. Change leadership and rallying the squad. Understanding and owning your leadership presence. And these are things that I have been talking about for many years. If you're one of my students listening to this, you've heard me talk about these topics in some kind of leadership training. And if you're, one of my friends, you may have heard me talk about this on my Instagram page. Nonetheless, I feel like this would be a good platform for me to expand upon these particular topics. So I hope that you enjoy them. And so with that said, something that I would like to do to close out each episode is by stating an affirmation and expressing some gratitude. As I mentioned earlier, spirituality is an important part of who I am, and mindfulness is an important part of who I am. And I think that two of the ways that I find to be most helpful for me to embody these components in my daily life is by sharing them with all of you. I feel like that's how I can be the most authentic and the most vulnerable and share a little bit of myself with you. So on that note, I will share my gratitude list. Actually, so before I go into that, one of the things about gratitude is I've learned in both reading as well as experience, there is a direct link between expressing gratitude and happiness. And so I have gotten into the habit of expressing gratitude on a daily basis just for the little things around me. Things like the sun shining for the day, or the fact that I made progress on something that I was working hard on. Examples of the ways in which I express gratitude. And I do find that I am much more satisfied with where I am in my life versus before, when I wasn't expressing gratitude. I was kind of always looking for something beyond me, like looking for the next thing, like trying to grasp it. And so I wanted to make expressing gratitude a segment in this podcast as we close out each one. So on that note, I'm grateful for your time and your attention. I recognize that time is our most precious resource, and the fact that you were willing to spend your time with me is truly, truly appreciated. So thank you for that. I am grateful for the experiences that have led me to create this podcast. I can't imagine my life going any other way, to get me right here to this moment. And lastly, I'm grateful for the support of my loved ones who understood my vision and were supportive in me going forward. I have a huge support network, and I am truly grateful for all of them, friends, family, former colleagues, they're just former students, amazing individuals who have been so supportive of me in my journey. And so I am very grateful for all of them. And so the other piece I want to end with is an affirmation. And so affirmations are just really good statements to help reinforce what it is that we are trying to do in our life. There is a lot of research that suggests that when we say things aloud about ourselves, our brain doesn't necessarily know the difference of whether or not that's past, present, or future. And so by us just saying it aloud, our brain is processing it as something that already exists. And so when we have positive affirmations or affirmations that support the thing that we are trying to accomplish or support what it is that we're trying to change, our brain already starts to make that transition in our head when we're seeing those things. So with that said, the affirmation for today is, I am evolving as a leader. I am open to learning new things that can enhance my skill set and strengthen my relationship with my team. I'll say that again. I am evolving as a leader. I am open to learning new things that enhance my skill set and strengthen my relationship with my team. Okay, so that pretty much wraps everything up for this first episode of Things My Boss Never Told Me, hosted by myself, Dr. Tasia White. I hope that you will continue with me on this journey, and I look forward to sharing more stories with you going forward. Thank you and have a wonderful day.